Hello, everyone. Before I introduce our speaker tonight, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and we will read those questions first at the end. And then once we've read those questions and ELyse has answered them, then we will go to live questions and answers afterwards as well. So you have two chances to ask questions. But tonight, I would like to introduce our speaker. She is back with a new subject, at least new to us, ELyse Zorn Karlin. She is the publisher and editor-in-chief of Adornment, the magazine of jewelry and related arts. She is a past president of the American Society of Jewelry Historians and is currently the co-director of the Association for the Study of Jewelry and Related Arts, the ASJRA, and you can go on that website to find out more about them. She runs the annual conference on jewelry and related arts and the annual Jewelry History Series in Miami, Florida every winter, which is going to happen again. She's also written books and has catalogs, and I could go on and on and on about ELyse. She's had so many accomplishments over her career, but I'm going to stop talking and welcome ELyse Zorn Karlin. She is going to be speaking about Victorian jewelry and also some well-known fakes. So please, let's give a warm welcome.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you for DCGIA for inviting me to come, and also for inviting ASTRA members to. Okay, so why did I title this lecture, Victorian Jewelry, a Many Splendored Thing? Well, this is why I named the lecture what I did, because there was so much going on in the Victorian period, and some of it are really marvels and very unusual features. And now I have the song Love is a Many Splendored Thing going through my head, and I can't get rid of it. So the Victorian period refers to the years that Queen Victoria was Queen of England for 63 years. But this is how most of us think of Victoria, as a dour, prim, and somewhat unhappy woman who was in mourning, but always wearing a lot of jewelry. And you can see both her hands, she's got a lot of rings on. And also note how she's draped her watch chain. Women wore them in different ways, and she's got kind of a unique way of doing it here. But Queen Victoria was really quite a lovely young woman, and she was only 18 years old when she ascended to the throne. She was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland from June 1837 until her death in 1901. In May 1876, she added the additional title of Empress of India. She was the longest reigning British monarch and the longest reigning queen regent in all of European history until the current queen, her great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth II, surpassed her in 2015. Victoria's reign was a period of industrial, cultural, political, scientific, and military change and growth within the United Kingdom, and was marked by a great expansion of the British Empire. However, by the time she became queen, the United Kingdom was an established constitutional monarchy in which the sovereign really held very little direct political power. Privately, she certainly attempted to influence government policy, but publicly, she became a national icon who was identified with strict standards of personal morality. In 1840, Victoria married her first cousin, Albert, Prince of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was the love of her life. Now, this ring is purported to be her engagement ring, and it's an interesting story, and I don't know where it's going to end yet. If you look on the internet, you will find lots of pictures of this ring, but none of them are the original ring, and there are a number of companies who make a reproduction and sell this ring for about $100. So I was curious what happened to this ring, and it's certainly, if it exists, it was very likely buried with her. However, I looked at two sources who are really experts on Victorian jewelry, and I spoke to two curators, and no one can verify that she had this ring. So it's a little bit of a mystery to me. And if anybody knows more about it, I would love to know. So at any rate, she married the love of her life, whether she had this ring or not. It's said that the queen hated being pregnant, viewed breastfeeding with disgust, and thought new babies were ugly. Nevertheless, she had 9 children with Albert. Their children married into royal and noble families across the continent, earning Victoria the sobriquet, the grandmother of Europe, and also spreading hemophilia. She had 42 grandchildren and 34 survived into adulthood. After Albert's death from typhoid fever in 1861, Victoria was plunged into deep mourning and avoided public appearances. The Queen brought regular mourning rituals to an entirely new level. In fact, by today's standards, they can be thought of as just plain weird. Every night, she would place a cast of Albert's hand on her pillow so that she could hold him while she slept. She insisted her staff lay out Albert's clothing every morning, as well as have his breakfast prepared and a bowl of hot water in his room for his shave, despite the fact that he'd been dead for years. She spent the rest of her life in black mourning dress, almost 40 years. This is not her dress, but it's the kind of dress she would have worn. It would have either been silk or crepe. You can see it's a heavy fabric, and it's embellished with jet beads. And this ring is her mourning ring in gold and black enamel, the bezel containing a small photograph of the prince consort Albert, which was dated to 1861, and the photograph is attributed to J.J.E. Mayall. The cipher or the monogram linking the initials V and A in white enamel are set on the shanks of either side of the ring. Now, this high fashion mourning, these black, very beautiful black dresses, could only be afforded by the wealthy and royalty. So commoners would try to keep up with the trend by dyeing their regular garments black and adorning them with black lace and veils for their hats. So at the bottom here, I think you can see this. This photograph of Queen Victoria is actually by J.J.E. Mayall, who did the picture of Albert. And Mayall was a rather famous pioneer in early photography. In May 1860, he made a number of portraits of the royal family. He was given permission to publish the portraits as a set of carte de visite. The carte de visite, or visiting cards, was a common practice in England. It was traded among friends and visitors in the 1860s. You would leave your card when you went to visit someone. Albums for one's collection would be very common to find in a Victorian parlor, and the immense popularity of the photographs when they were added to the cards led to the publication and collection of photographs of prominent people like Queen Victoria. Mayall's cards were released in the form of a royal album consisting of 14 small portraits of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, and their children. The royal album was an immediate success, and hundreds of thousands of albums were sold. So the photo that we see here in this ring probably came from those photographs that Mayall took, and they were taken in the same year that Albert died. So I guess it was somewhat lucky that the photograph existed. So you just saw the black dress. It had kind of a full skirt, and I wanted you to have an understanding of what went underneath that skirt. Here's another dress of a similar style. This is what would be known as a cage crinoline. It was made with either steel or whalebone, and you can imagine that that's steel wire, how heavy that would be to wear underneath your dress. This dates to about the 1840s and 50s and even the 60s. And by the time we get to the 60s, excuse me, the skirt has become the widest it's going to be before the silhouette changes. And here's a cartoon showing the problem with that big skirt. Not a lot of room for the men to sit at the table. And this is probably when it was at its wisest. So not only did Victoria become the model for the clothing to be worn, but for the jewelry as well. Jewelry made with black or dark materials became very popular with her subjects, including those made with jet, gutta percha, bog oak, and other materials. Here we see a suite or a parure of jet and also a locket holding 4 family members. Jet is a type of lignite. It's the lowest rank of coal, and it's used as a gemstone, and it takes polish very well. It's derived from the wood that is changed under pressure during a long period of time, and it's mostly from Whitby, England, which was pretty much mined out, although there's still some jet jewelry being made in Whitby. And I did read that actually some jet's found in the United States. At the top, we have gutta percha and vulcanite. I'm not sure if these pictures are gutta percha or vulcanite. Gutta percha comes from a tree in Malaysia, and it's a rubber-like natural thermoplastic. It was commonly molded, but sometimes carved. Stronger than rubber, it holds its fine, sharper detail than other plastics in the era. Vulcanite is derived from natural rubber, which is hardened through the addition of sulfur, and it was even used in rubber tires. It too is moldable and frequently starts out black, but upon exposure to light or water, it oxidizes to a variety of colors, but frequently a brown or brown-green. Bog oak, which is what we see at the bottom, is derived from fossilized trees buried in peat bogs for long periods of time, which are deprived of oxygen. Mostly these pieces have Irish motifs, as you can see, the shamrock and the harp, the Irish harp. So that's one way to tell the difference between bog oak and the other materials. And there were other black materials that were used because it was never enough jet for everything. There was something called Vauxhall glass, which was made by a company called Vauxhall Glass Works in England, but that also comes in other colors. French jet was another kind of black glass. And there was something called crepestone, which is actually a glass that's treated with a chemical so that it can be carved. And I actually found it, crepestone, tiny little brooches in Montgomery Ward and Bloomingdale catalogs from the late 19th century. They were very inexpensive to buy. Hair jewelry made from real hair was either woven into wearable jewelry, formed into designs under glass, or placed in compartments in the back of the jewelry. The jewelry became important keepsakes to remember a lost loved one or someone who was at a distance. And you could either send your hair out to be molded into one of these pieces, or you could follow instructions to do it at home. In the top piece, we see hair that's been shaped into a Prince of Wales feather, which is the coat of arms for the Prince of Wales. It's made from 3 ostrich feathers, and this imitates that. And at the bottom, we see woven hair under glass, and then jewelry that's actually made from the hair with glass fittings and findings. In the United States, Americans pretty much followed this style of mourning jewelry and dress. In fact, Abraham Lincoln actually died only 3 months after Albert, and Mary Todd Lincoln certainly followed Victoria's example. For more than a year, 6 months longer than was called for mourning rules of the day, Mary wore first-degree mourning. So what that means is that she stayed in all black. The rules of etiquette were that after 6 months, you could go to a deep purple or a mauve color, and she stayed in black just like Victoria did. In the first picture, you can see she's wearing her mourning jewelry, which is onyx with pearls. There's a bracelet and necklace, and also note how she's wearing her watch chain. I think she's got a buckle or some other pin at the waist. Interesting story about Mary Todd Lincoln, because I've done a lot of research about first ladies, is that Yvonne Markowitz and I wrote an article years ago having to do with a Lincoln mourning jewel, and we looked into her mourning jewelry. And we determined that she had very little because she was in deep financial trouble when Lincoln died. She had overextended herself, but she had some, and we realized that she probably had it from when her 2 sons had died. So this set you see on her a lot. And in the other picture, her black crepe straw bonnet is so heavily veiled that she could not turn her head. It was too heavy. So it gives her an odd appearance as she's always facing forward, even when her body's slightly turned the other way. As we get later into the Victorian period, around the mid-70s, the hips and the behind are enlarged. That's the new style, wearing a bustle at the back. So this dress is quite exaggerated, and we see these charming women practicing dancing with a little girl, and she's probably got a little bit of a bustle too. The later Victorian dress, instead of the full skirt, had a tighter silhouette, but we did have the bustle, and we had the knee for a corset for the waist. These dresses were made out of heavy material, and heavy jewelry suited it. And just to show you, there were many different kinds of bustles that you could purchase. And some of them were pretty heavy, and some were more like padding, so you had your choice. And they were so ridiculous that men made fun of them, as in this cartoon. They thought that a woman walking around with a bustle on her derriere looked sort of like a snail carrying her shell around on her back. And corsets, of course, made that little waist make the hips even more exaggerated. The picture at the top, these women look happy in their corsets, but I'm sure they were not. They were not comfortable. The corsets required either whalebone or metal to give them their shape, and that can't have been comfortable. Here we see on the bottom an ad talking about the various kinds of bustles you could buy. And here we see Vivian Leigh in Gone with the Wind being laced up so that she will have a tiny little waist. Now I want to fast forward just for a minute to a few decades later. Corsets to a certain extent disappeared at the end of the century, but some women were still wearing them in the early 20th century. In fact, shortly after the United States entry into World War I in 1917, the US War Industries Board asked women to stop buying corsets to free up metal for war production. This step liberated some 28,000 tons of metal, enough to build 2 battleships. I just wanted to show you what the metal for 2 battleships looked like. And of course, in the 80s, Madonna brought back the corset as a fashion statement. And I found a funny little anecdote about this corset, which of course was designed by John Paul Gaultier. He actually didn't originally design this for her. When he was a kid, he wanted a doll, and his parents wouldn't let him have it because he was a boy. So they got him a teddy bear, and he designed what he called the cone bra for his teddy bear. So getting back to the Victorian style, heavy jewelry, and lots of it, was worn with the heavy clothing. This is mid-century to later, mid-century, a parure of jewelry, which wealthy women would wear. It might have 2 bracelets, a necklace, earrings, a ring, hair adornments, all kinds of things. This malachite parure is actually believed to have belonged to Empress Josephine of France. So styles were not just in England, the United States, they were on the continent. So now I'd like to talk about some unusual materials in Victorian jewelry. And the first one we have is tiger's claw jewelry. Because Victoria was Empress of colonial India, Brits would bring them back with them when they were living there or visiting, or in some cases, they actually shot a tiger. If you go to the FDR Museum in upstate New York, Eleanor Roosevelt's father killed a tiger, and an entire parure of tiger's claw is in the museum that he had given her. And I doubt she ever wore it because she didn't wear a lot of jewelry, but she had great feelings for her father, who died when she was very young. Some of these were mounted in England, some were mounted in India, and they were traditionally worn as charms against evil spirits. But I found out something interesting. They are still being worn as amulets in India. And despite the fact there's only 100 tigers left in all of India today, there are thousands of tiger claws for sale. So that tells us that they are not all really tiger's claw. And in fact, most of them are made from cattle horn that's been molded. And the only way to tell is by a DNA analysis, which is probably not worth it. More organic materials, we have coral and we have ivory. We have carved coral up here, and then a little piece of branch coral in a brooch that would have been sold in a place like Bloomingdale's for $1. As far as coral goes, I explain a little bit about it. The part of coral that is used for jewelry is actually not the living organism, but rather its carbonate secretions, which form the structure that the polyps live on. And although it's not the living part of the animal, it's essential for its survival. In 7,000 Years of Jewelry, the book by Hugh Tate, he describes coral as a material to which in the ancient world, great amuletic powers had been attributed. It is said, according to Greek mythology, to have originated as the spurts of blood gushing forth from Medusa's head that had been severed by Perseus. And I do remember reading about this because I'm very interested in Medusa. Medusa would kill any man who looked at her, but he figured out a way to slay her without looking directly at her. And then he flew away on Pegasus, which is his winged horse, which sprang out of somebody else's something. It's complicated, but he was carrying Medusa's head in his hand as he flew across the water, and the blood from her head dropped into the water, and that's supposedly how coral was formed. The world's coral reefs are threatened by pollution today, overharvesting, and climate change. Several species of coral have been declared endangered and are now regulated, and more than 180 countries restrict its harvesting. Today, the use of coral in jewelry is quite controversial. Even though it's still popular, many jewelers who are still using it repurpose it from vintage pieces, and others have stopped using it altogether. At the bottom, we see two pieces of ivory. You'll see that the earrings are little pooties or angels, just like the coral piece above was a very common motif. And the carved kind of forest scene with deer is probably from Germany. Seed pearls were also a favored type of jewelry. These tiny natural pearls were probably no more than 2 millimeters in diameter. They could be found in such abundance that they were not considered rare as other natural pearls were at this time. Remember, this is pre-cultural pearl time. They were turned into jewelry mostly by being strung on horsehair and then attached to a mother of pearl base. They are, however, quite delicate and difficult to wear because imagine if any of these strings break, the pearls are everywhere. So even though they'd be wonderful to wear with a wedding dress today, it'd be a little treacherous. Seed pearl jewelry was also created in the 18th century, as we know, because down in the corner, this little dove brooch belonged to Martha Washington. And it does have some other pearls in it, some Baroque pearls. But it's believed that she purchased this dove brooch because it was right after the Revolutionary War. And for her, it was a symbol of peace. But she did have other seed pearl jewelry, which is on view and also in the archives at Mount Vernon. And Mary Todd Lincoln's inauguration jewelry, which is a demi-parure, 2 bracelets and a necklace, was also made of seed pearls. Abe acquired it from Tiffany and Company for her. And unfortunately, he couldn't afford the whole parure, so this is what she got. And this set is now in the Library of Congress. It belongs to the American people. Just an interesting side note, there was an important jeweler in Washington. They were sort of the Tiffany of Washington, called Galt Brothers. They went out of business about 10 years ago. They were a very important firm. And they also claim to have created this parure, but it appears that they made a copy, an identical copy. So we really do believe Tiffany and Company made the original. Another form of material which seems unusual is lava jewelry, which came from Mount Vesuvius. People would travel to Italy and they would come home with some lava jewelry, and it comes in different colors. And here we see a snake necklace in various colors. And again, it could harken back to Victoria's engagement ring, maybe not. This has been a symbol of enduring love for going back thousands of years. But since we're looking at the snake made of lava, I thought I would introduce here that there was a lot of snake jewelry in the 19th century, often set with turquoise, and turquoise turned up in a lot of the jewelry. This is an Etruscan revival bracelet, which I'll talk about more in a little while. Another unusual material is operculum. Operculum is the little door of a snail. When it's a secreted plate that when the snail crawls back into his shell, this is what covers it. And it's very interesting. It's usually this greenish color, but it can sometimes be other colors. Tortoiseshell is another important material. It comes from the hawksbill tortoise, which is now endangered. You can't use this tortoiseshell anymore. And it was chosen for its desirable colors. You could heat it to bend it or carve it. And on the bottom, we see a tortoiseshell brooch with a piece of operculum set into it. And the earrings on the right are piqué, which it was heated in little pieces of gold or silver, and a design would be set in. And it wasn't just jewelry that was made this way. There were objects, I think even tables and furniture were made this way. Jewelry set with garnets was also quite popular. The stones came from the region of Bohemia, which would later become Czechoslovakia. The region produced beautiful deep red gemstones, but a word of caution. Reproduction garnet jewelry, Victorian garnet jewelry, is being made today and can be quite convincing. I have a pair of earrings that I was fooled with, which I still love wearing, and everybody thinks they're old, but I even asked questions and I got fooled anyway. Another form of popular jewelry was known as Mizpah jewelry. The word comes from the Old Testament. In the book of Genesis, Jacob and Laban are given the wisdom to reconcile their differences and live peacefully. Now, the story of Jacob and Laban was that Laban was Jacob's uncle, and Jacob wanted to marry his daughter Rachel. So Laban told him if he worked very hard for him for 2 years, I think, then he could marry Rachel. But he fooled him, and instead he ended up marrying Rachel's sister Leah. And eventually Jacob took Rachel for a second wife, but they eventually made up. And as a symbol of their trust, they built a tower or a Mizpah. Before parting, Laban salutes Jacob. The Lord watched between me and thee when we were absent, one from another. Today, there are people making modern Mizpah jewelry and giving it to loved ones as a reminder that they are loved always, no matter where they are, apart or together. Some Mizpah pendants are designed to split apart so that each person can wear half of the pendant as a reminder of their love until they are together again. Another form of sentimental jewelry was acrostic or regard jewelry. This actually dates back to the early 19th century, but it continued to be favored in the Victorian era. The jewelry in this genre uses the first letters of the stones to spell out sentimental messages like regard or adore. For example, the word regard would be ruby, emeralds, garnet, amethyst, ruby, diamond. Deciphering the secret word that the stones stand for isn't always easy, though, because gems were sometimes called by different names at different times, and so might vary according to when the piece was made. Another style that became popular in the 19th century was sporting jewelry, which utilized motifs such as horses, foxes, horseshoes, hounds, birds, etc. Another sign of the time that things have changed, because I believe that fox hunting has been banned in England now since 2004. This technique that was used to make this jewelry was often employed in conjunction with these sporting motifs and was called reverse crystal jewelry, also known as Essex jewelry. It was a technique that originated in Belgium in 1860. The rock crystals came from Brazil or Madagascar and were used as well-formed cabochons. A watercolor rendering of the image was painted on the underside of the cabochon, and an oil and diamond dust mixture was used with scribing tools to carve the design into the interior of the crystal. At one point in the later 19th century, there was a vogue for wearing jewelry made of iridescent Brazilian beetles that were dried and lacquered. Pretty weird. But even weirder was the use of hummingbird heads that were mounted in jewelry. And this was done in the United States too, not just in England. This was a time of exploration in South and Central America where these would have come from. And so they were considered very exotic. And I don't have a picture of it, but excuse me, Princess Alexandra, when she was still princess, not queen, has been photographed with, she had a big round fan made of white turkey feathers. I guess they were dyed. And right in the center, she had an entire stuffed hummingbird. Some women even took the trend too far and wore animals that were alive. I've read a lot of stories, but I'll just tell you of one. I read of a lady who in 1891 strapped a diamond on the back of a Brazilian beetle, and she somehow got it to fly around her neck during an event. So I'm sure she was the most noticed person there. And I thought I would mention a related fashion item because it's amazing to me. And that's bird hats that had full birds mounted on the lady's hat. Apparently, the bigger, the better. And men were so perplexed. Wouldn't you be if somebody saw you with a bird on your head, that this cartoon shows how silly it seemed. In fact, so many birds were killed that it led to the founding of the Audubon Society in 1895 in the United States. Now I'm going to talk about something that's not often discussed in jewelry lectures, and that's men's jewelry and clothing of the Victorian period. This costume that I'm going to show you dates from about the 1860s forward. At that time, it was fashionable for men's coats and jackets to be single-breasted and semi-fitted, extending to the mid-thigh. The trousers were often cut from a narrow checked fabric. The overcoats had wide lapels and deep cuffs and often featured contrasting velvet collars. Top hats briefly became the stove type kind, the tall hat that they're wearing here. And of course, that's what Abe Lincoln wore. The bowler hat gained popularity as an informal hat. And just as a point of interest, hair was parted in the center and moderately waved. Men wore Dundreary whiskers or Piccadilly weepers, long side whiskers that were often worn with a full beard and a drooping mustache. With this clothing, they wore shirts of linen or cotton, which featured high, upstanding, or turnover collars. And over time, as the century got later, the ties got wider. They were tied in a bow or looped into a loose knot, similar to the way men wear ties today. And they would be fastened with a stick pin. And here are some examples of stick pins. Men also wore cufflinks, and we see a pair of agate at the top. And again, we see the snake motif. And they wore pocket watches. And here we see a watch with a chain. And we also see how it was worn with a fob. It would be attached by the button of the vest, and then the watch would go in the pocket. And I did want to point out that women wore these watches as well. I showed you before, but you didn't actually see the watch because it was hidden on the woman's form. This is another way to wear a watch like this with what's called the slide chain. And it looks to me like she's wearing a lava cameo. I'm not sure, but that's what it looks like. An important genre of jewelry in the 19th century was historical revival jewelry. Jewelry influenced or copied from earlier periods in history. We find Gothic revival, Renaissance revival, Etruscan or Roman revival, ancient Greek, Assyrian, and Egyptian revival, all making their marks on 19th century jewelry. This jewelry was influenced by the archaeological digs and other finds in the 19th century, among other factors. This is a portrait of Lady Layard and her jewelry made from actual ancient pieces, not reproduction pieces. And her necklace pieces date between 2200 and 350 BC. Her husband, Henry Layard, was the first to excavate the ancient Assyrian capitals of Nimrod and Nineveh and had this necklace made for her with seals he acquired in his travels. The cylinder seals are from several different ancient civilizations. So her jewelry was actually ancient jewelry, but it helped to fuel the reproduction or revival pieces. In terms of Gothic revival in England, A.W.N. Pugin, or Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, was an important influence. He was an architect, a designer, artist, and critic who was principally remembered for his pioneering role in the Gothic revival of architecture. His work culminated in designing the interior of the Palace of Westminster in London and the iconic clock tower, which houses Big Ben. Big Ben is the bell, not the clock, or sometimes they're referred to together as Big Ben, but it's the largest of the 5 bells in the tower. He also designed some jewelry, which we see here, that was executed by the jeweler John Hardman. Pugin designed this set of jewelry, and I believe this is only part of the set, for the woman he asked to be his third wife, who turned him down. He ended up giving the demi-parrot to the woman he eventually married. This is in the Victorian Albert. It's a headband, a brooch, a necklace with pendant, cross, and it's garnet and pearls, and was made in 1848. The interest in Etruscan revival jewelry began during the 18th century Georgian period, when the ruins of Pompeii in 1748 and Herculaneum in 1738 were discovered. Yet the actual Etruscan revival pieces of jewelry were not created until a century later, when jewelry making techniques became more sophisticated. Many Etruscan revival pieces date to the 1860s to the 1880s and probably began with the Castellani firm. Fortunato Pio Castellani founded his business in 1814 in Rome. His early pieces of jewelry were mostly in contemporary European styles, influenced by French, English, and Swiss designs, and aimed at the tourist trade. However, at some point, he realized there might really be a market for reproductions of ancient classical jewelry that was being regularly excavated at the time. He was joined in the business by two of his sons, Alessandro and Augusto, and they began to focus on this kind of jewelry. They experimented with ancient techniques like granulation and others, and worked in a number of different revival styles. So here we see a micro mosaic brooch, gorgeous brooch, and it's a head of Medusa again. She pops up all the time. And this is an actual Roman floor, ancient Roman floor with Medusa. Here is a Greek piece by Castellani, fabulous granulation. And then you see it's Dionysus, who's the Greek god of grapes and winemaking. And then we see an actual ancient piece. This French necklace is Greek revival. And here's an ancient necklace. No 19th century lady or gentleman visiting Italy would consider a tour of Rome complete without a stop at Castellani's to purchase one of his fashionable pieces of archaeological revival jewelry. The opening of a branch in London around 1860, which was managed by Castellani's pupil, Carlo Giuliano, helped to further popularize the style and eventually allowed Giuliano to set up his own firm. So we see there was Egyptian revival jewelry too, because the opening of the Suez Canal created interest in it. Giuliano, before he arrived in England, is not well known. All we really know is that he worked for Castellani. His early work focused largely on revivalist designs, not exact copies, but inspired by archaeological jewelry. Giuliano referred to himself as an artist jeweler, and his work attracted a varied and local clientele, including Queen Victoria. He left his business to his two sons, Carlo and Arthur, who he had ensured were trained and capable of continuing his name and reputation. Unfortunately, the shop closed in 1914 after his son Arthur committed suicide. Other designs related to another style of revival jewelry is the Renaissance or Tudor style. There were a number of influences for this kind of jewelry. Throughout Europe, costume balls had become a popular form of entertainment, and the costumes were copied in great detail from historical paintings. In the 1870s to 80s, a series of 16th century jewelry designs and ornamental prints were republished, providing an inspiration for French neo-Renaissance jewels. And in England, of course, there was the history of the Tudor kings and queens and many paintings of them. So here we see three Renaissance revival jewels. The first one is by John Brogden, who I'll talk about in a minute. The center one is Castellani, showing he worked in every kind of revival style. And the third one is by a French jeweler, Froment Maurice. The South Kensington Museum regularly purchased articles of jewelry from various purveyors, including Francois Désiré Froment Maurice, who worked in the French Renaissance style. And the museum put them on display to the public. Froment Maurice employed sculptors, modelers, chasers, enamelers, goldsmith, and others in his shop where he made these beautiful jewels. And his work at the 1851 exhibition earned him a medal for his patented silver historic French figural designs. John Brogden was one of the best known and most prolific of Victorian manufacturing jewelers in England during the second half of the 19th century. He exhibited successfully at the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London's Crystal Palace, showing a range of jewelry designs, including archaeological revival style pieces inspired by the recently discovered ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh. Examples of his Assyrian, Egyptian, and Renaissance revival jewelry can be found at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the British Museum, among others. And I should mention that he employed Mrs. Charlotte Newman, who was one of the few women working in a jewelry firm that was well known. And when he died, she took over his business under her own name and kept all the men that worked for him. And so we consider her maybe the first woman jeweler whose name we know. So she's very important. And just to show you a Giuliano, gorgeous Renaissance-inspired jewel. Another influence was the Devonshire parure. In 1856, this important suite of jewelry was commissioned for the Countess of Granville to wear as she accompanied her husband, the ambassador extraordinary and representative of Queen Victoria, to the coronation of Tsar Alexander II in Moscow. This suite, known as the Devonshire parure, is comprised of 7 ornaments, which includes a coronet, a diadem, a bandeau, comb, necklace, stomacher, and a bracelet. They were created from enamel gold, and their purpose was to show off a collection of 88 cameos and intaglios, ancient ones, from the 3rd Duke of Devonshire's collection. The parure is believed to be the first piece made in the Holbein-esque style, which is a form of Renaissance revival. I'll talk about that more in a minute. This parure is still existing, and it's now on display at Chatsworth House, home of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire. Here we see a Holbein-esque jewel. I believe this is by Giuliano, and it's influenced by paintings by Hans Holbein the Younger. This painting dates to 1536 and is a portrait of Queen Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife. John Brogden and Carlo Giuliano were 2 of the most prominent jewelers working in the Holbein-esque style. And beyond some sketches that Holbein actually made for jewelry, he didn't execute it. There weren't collections of Renaissance jewelry at the time to use as models. So it was mainly paintings that were the inspiration for this jewelry. The artists I've just spoken about all either copied old jewelry directly or were influenced by it. They were clear about what they were doing, and people who bought their jewelry knew exactly what they were buying, jewelry that was made in their own lifetime. But there was a darker side to these revivals. At a time when true Renaissance jewelry, 16th century jewelry, was sought after by collectors, there were very talented goldsmiths who were making jewelry meant to deceive collectors in museums and being offered as genuine Renaissance jewelry. There were also married pieces that were part Renaissance and part 19th century additions or improvements, if we want to be kind, that may not have intentionally been meant to deceive, but perhaps a collector repaired an old piece that he had, and then at some point it got in the marketplace and was sold as an original 16th century piece. Today, we find in many museums and probably in some private collections, jewels that are not what they appear to be. So how do you know what's real 16th century, which is very rare to find, a 19th century fake, or a pastiche, an old piece that's been added or repaired in the 19th century? My belief is the only way to really know, except for being a very experienced curator or collector, is to have the jewelry looked at by a conservator. Today, many conservators have backgrounds in chemistry where they once would have had a background in the arts or sculpture. And this is very important because chemistry is important to detect these fakes. Renaissance jewels were made with gold, cloisonné, enamel, en-ronde-basse enamel, and champlevé enamel. They featured precious stones and pearls, and sometimes, once in a while, a piece will turn up in silver which is in and of itself a red flag. But the best way to tell is by analyzing the enamels, which were different in the 16th century than the 19th century. For example, arsenic was used in the 19th century to make white enamel more opaque. And believe it or not, women used it to make their skin whiter. The enamels in the 19th century had more lead oxide than in the 16th century, and there are other differences as well. The way to discern these differences is to do an X-ray microanalysis with a scanning electron microscope, and you take just a very tiny sample of the enamel so you don't damage it. But yes, did I really say that women were using arsenic on their skin? Well, I had to look into it. It turns out that in the late 19th century, pale skin was encouraged. Women wore veils and gloves and parasols to keep the sun off of them. But you could also buy at Sears and Roebuck a popular product called Dr. Rose's arsenic complexion wafers, which were just that, little white chalk wafers filled with arsenic for delicate nibbling. You ingested them. They were specifically advertised as being perfectly harmless. Women also used ammonia to wash their face, creams and powders, including a bright white paint that was filled with lead that they delicately painted over their features, and other suggestive beautifiers were belladonna and opium. It's not that they didn't know these materials were dangerous, but they thought in small quantities it would be safe, and people did get sick. Now we talk about the fakes. This is a beautiful Renaissance style pendant by Reinhold Vasters. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I love the title. It's a Triton riding a unicorn-like sea creature. It was probably made about 1870 to 1895. Vasters was probably the most famous 19th century forger. In 1978, more than 1,000 drawings by the German goldsmith Vasters was discovered in the archives of the Victoria and Albert Museum. The designs, mostly of Renaissance jewelry, had been given to the museum in 1919, but received little attention at the time. Vasters' property was sold when he died in 1909 and was purchased by an art dealer who showed them to a V&A curator in 1912. The curator had no interest. 60 years later, the designs have now been used to identify many jewels and objects believed to be genuine Renaissance pieces, but happen to match Vasters' 19th century designs. Since this discovery, museums around the world have had to look at their pieces more closely, and by examining materials and techniques, they have found these pieces were made in the 19th century. Not a great deal about Vasters is known, but it's known he was a very accomplished goldsmith. He may have begun making these faux Renaissance jewels as legitimate reproductions, but it's clear that over time he knew they were being used to fool people and were sold as true Renaissance pieces. Vasters sold his pieces to French dealer Frédéric Spitzer, and it is known that there were other artists linked to Spitzer who probably were also creating fakes for him. Vasters' jewels, some of which may be partially 16th century with additions, can be found in the British Museum, the Walters Art Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and others. And no doubt they have not all been discovered yet. Now, this is a pastiche. It turns out that only the horseman himself is original to the 16th century. The rest of the jewel is 19th century edition. The maker is unknown. This piece is in the Rijksmuseum in Netherlands, and it's known as the portrait of a horseman on a pedestal. It has a very interesting provenance. It belonged to Dr. Fritz Mannheimer, who was a very wealthy Dutch banker. Fritz had quite a story. He originally was unmarried till he was older age, but he had a lot of women that he catered to. And one of them, he bought a gold bathtub. And when he finally decided to marry later in life, he was a very obese man, and he ended up having a heart attack at his wedding. And they somehow revived him to finish the wedding, but he died 2 months later of a heart attack. So after he died, the collection passed through several hands, and then it was acquired by Hitler for the museum he was planning to create in Vienna, which we know never happened. It ended up in the salt mines in Altsee, Austria, where it was intended to be blown up with other works of art if the Allies were approaching. However, it was recovered after the war and taken to Munich, where it was eventually returned to the Netherlands and given to the Rijksmuseum. It had been believed to be a completely Renaissance jewel until recent times when it was analyzed. Research into the material and techniques indicated it was a pastiche. And to just talk a little bit more about fakes, these are all pieces in the British Museum by unknown makers. There's Spanish, French, Hungarian, Italian, and they're all fakes. None of them are 16th century, they're 19th century, except for one may have been altered. I believe it's this one down here. The original pearl in the center could have been original. As late as the 1980s, most of these jewels and others were accepted and displayed as 16th century pieces. They were purchased for a lot of money by members of the wealthy Rothschild family, who eventually donated them to the British Museum. Careful analysis recently has revealed both small and large anomalies of materials and construction and have made it clear that gems are skillful forgeries. And so now we go back to our Victorian styles. Towards the end of the jewelry, the clothing got slimmer, the jewelry got more delicate. Fabrics were lighter and styles started to take hold that not always required restrictive corsets, and bustles were gone. Women were more active, bicycling, playing tennis, playing croquet. Fewer pieces of jewelry were worn all at one time. And the jewelry got lighter and more delicate as well. While mainstream fashion changes began at the end of the 19th century, there was also another genre of clothing known as reform clothing that was worn mainly in artistic circles beginning around the 1880s. No crinolines, no corsets, no bustles. With this clothing, the jewelry of the arts and crafts movement, made from about 1890 to 1915, went well, but that's a subject for another lecture. These newer styles would segue into the Edwardian period manner of dress and jewelry when Victoria's son Edward became king upon her death, and his wife Alexandra became queen and the new trendsetter. All very light and airy. However, Edward was only king for 10 years and things moved on. In 1897, Victoria had written instructions for her funeral, which was to be a military funeral as befitting of a soldier's daughter and the head of the army. And she ordered that everything be white instead of the traditional black. She died at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, requiring her body to be conveyed by boat and train to Waterloo Station, then by gun carriage to Paddington Station, and then by train to Windsor for the funeral service itself. It is said that she was buried with her engagement ring and her wedding ring and Albert's wedding ring, according to her will. However, I can't confirm that. I believe it to be true. Her will is at Windsor Castle. Her papers are actually digitized, except you have to be a UK citizen to access them. So I'm going to have to find somebody to try to do that for me. So I can't confirm this, but I think it's probably true. It's said that according to her will, she was buried with a ring on every finger, bracelets stacked along her wrists, and her neck layered with necklaces. So in other words, you can take it with you. For her funeral, she was dressed in a white dress and her wedding veil. An array of mementos commemorating her extended family, friends, and servants were laid in the coffin with her at her request by her doctor and dressers. One of Albert's dressing gowns was placed by her side with the plaster cast of his hand, while a lock of John Brown's hair, along with a picture of him, was placed in her left hand, concealed from the view of her family by a carefully positioned bunch of flowers. Through the 1860s, Victoria had relied increasingly on a manservant from Scotland named John Brown. Slanderous rumors of a romantic connection and even a secret marriage appeared in print, and she was referred to sometimes as Mrs. Brown. Victoria even published a book, Leaves from the Journal of Our Life in the Highlands, which featured Brown prominently and in which the Queen praised him highly. Items of jewelry were placed on Victoria's body, including the wedding ring that John Brown's mother had worn and was given to Victoria by Brown in 1883. Also at her direction, and this we can confirm, when she died, a group of her jewels were especially meaningful to her, were placed in the Albert Room at Windsor Castle. This is the room where Albert died and where she kept water and breakfast material for him every morning. The Queen left instructions for a specific list of personal jewelry to be placed there and not passed on to her family. This included a bracelet of lockets that contained a personal memento of hair or a photograph of each of her family members, her children, which can be seen through the dates and inscriptions upon the lockets themselves. Other jewels placed in the Albert Room included Queen Victoria's first ring, which is this little emerald ring here, a ring given to Queen Victoria in 1854 by the 8 royal children and containing their hair, a silver and gold triple hinged ring with hands clasped, set with diamonds and turquoise, which opens to reveal an inner ring with 2 hearts. This was given by her mother on Albert's birthday, the year he and Victoria were married, and a bracelet with 15 ovals of hand-tinted photographs of her grandchildren set in gold. These pieces are all now in the royal collection, and the information on the sites shows that these pieces actually were in the Albert Room. She had intended for the Albert Room to stay this way, but when Edward became king, when she died, he turned the room immediately into a study. It was the end of an era. And my last slide, I just want to say thank you to Queen Victoria. Through the portal of Victorian jewelry, I entered the fabulous world of jewelry history and antique jewelry when I was only 12 years old. It's been a long time, so I'm glad to be able to salute her. Thank you.